All right, welcome back to the Grand Solar Minimum channel. Today is Sunday, January 19th. This is a special edition. We have our special guest here, Lee Wheelbarger from KLW News. That's World News, I should say, KLW World News. Lee, long time since we've been together on the show like this. Good to have you. How's it going?
It's going well. Thanks for having me.
Lee, if you don't mind, it's been a long time. This channel hasn't been as active as it used to be in the past. So I'd kind of like for you, if you wouldn't mind, just kind of talk about a little bit about yourself and your qualifications to be able to speak about solar cycles and everything that's related to it.
All right. Well, I'm inventor Lee Wheelbarger. I'm the inventor of the U.S. Army helmet cam, which turned into telemedicine. Some of you may be familiar with that technology. I invented the universal backup handcuff key. I was the senior technologist for the U.S. Army, senior technical staff for CCOM. I invented the PBS 14 night vision goggle. I own KLW World News. I have a lot of different inventions. I have 30 years experience in electronics, optical equipment, thermal imagers, night vision. I'm the one who introduced the grand solar minimum to Jake. And Jake and I have been talking about the grand solar minimum for over a decade. I'm currently on Rumble and have 8 channels there. Located just south of Dallas, Texas. And we are experiencing the grand solar minimum here today as the overnight temperature was 24, which is 10 degrees below average. I was surprised when my mother-in-law came by the studio this morning and said, "Wow, your prediction of the grand solar minimum is right on." So I plan on sharing whatever I can with you guys here today.
Yeah, Lee, and since you mentioned temperatures and everything, I went ahead and played a map real quick, and I'll cut back to you. But yeah, you did introduce me to this topic a long time ago, and it all connected. Everything that I was seeing, that I was observing in the skies, I was observing with our sun, was all created by the effects of solar activity or the lack thereof. And what's interesting is that we get to once again report on another minimum cycle. When we started doing this, this was back in late 2016. We were coming out of a max and getting ready to go into a minimum cycle. In fact, I believe the minimum was pretty close to almost here. So it's kind of good that we've been able to observe a full cycle. And after all these years of all these predictions that we've had, and many people that we've spoke to about seismic activity and climate and when the warming stops and when the cooling begins. And like you said, we're seeing that right now. In fact, the South is getting ready to endure an historic storm that I don't think, when was the last time we've seen that kind of snow accumulation
It's been a long time.
in the South? I mean, I lived in Middle Tennessee for a year, and they get a half inch of snow, and they're shutting everything down. Schools
Right.
are closed. The rest, place of businesses are closed. They're not equipped down there in the South to deal with this kind of weather. And what I mean by equipped, I mean plow trucks. They don't have a plan. They don't have that many plow trucks. They don't have that much supply of salt. In fact, they probably don't ever refill their salt supply. They just probably letting it sit for many years. And then of course there is a lot of dirt roads and gravel roads out there in the South. I know, Lee, you're probably familiar with it being in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the biggest concern too, is that travel now becomes impossible when we get these kinds of storms like what we're seeing in the South.
And they have no experience in driving in this either.
No, that's the worst. I know I live
Right.
in the Northeast, and when we start seeing the weather get bad up here, we still have tons of accidents. So imagine, yeah, that's a great point, Lee. I can only imagine how much more magnified that problem becomes because there's lack of experience in the South for this kind of weather. So,
Yeah, when we have freezing rain down here in Texas, people are either at home or in the ditch because they can't drive. I mean, they fly down the interstate when it's dry or even when it's wet. But as soon as it turns to ice, they don't realize what they're up against. And there's cars out in the middle of fields and into guardrails. There's more cars into the Jersey wall than are on the road.
With some of the things that we really studied in the beginning of this, Lee, was TSI, and then the one source mission ended in 2020, I believe. So it's
Mhm.
been kind of, we haven't really watched it. And then I got a link from a subscriber. Thankfully, I have found a way to report once again on TSI numbers. It's not real time, it's not daily, but it is a 7 day reporting. So right now, the last report I have for the TSI was January 14th. Some of the things that are really interesting about the TSI is it is also another way that we can see when our peak started and when our peak is beginning to drop again. Um, the thing that I find interesting is that with temperatures as warm as they have been in 2024, and that was mainly due to solar forcing, increased
Mhm.
output from the sun during a maximum cycle. Yes, the sunspots do create cooling spots, but when the sunspots are surrounded by facula, that's 30 times the size of the sunspot itself. That makes up for the lack of output from the sunspot, and the facula makes up for the output. So, with that all being said, this past summer of record warmth really made sense to me when it comes to looking at the sun and the conditions here on Earth and across the solar system. Um, I know we briefly talked about this, but Tonga having that explosion back in 2022, water vapor is in parts of the atmosphere that usually is not up there, and there is abundance of it. And you top
Mhm.
that with uh, increased solar activity, and obviously, TSI has shown us that we had readings at 1364 and higher. And if you remember, Lee, when we first started watching
Mhm.
this, we were talking about 1360 and a little bit
Mhm.
lower. So TSI has went up, what, 4 squared watts per meter probably since 2016, obviously because of the maximum. Can you talk to us a little bit about TSI and your knowledge that you know about how this affects?
Well, TSI, first off, is total solar irradiance. That's the amount of light that we see in an area in a square meter. And you've got actually two different levels of TSI. You have the TSI that the US uses, which is what you're quoting. And then you also have the TSI that the Europeans use, which is not the same. So, the first thing to understand is when you're talking about the TSI numbers, be sure to which one you're talking about, whether it be US or European. Um, TSI can vary significantly. In fact, years ago, we had a sunspot go across the front of the sun, and the TSI dropped by 34 as that sunspot progressed across the front of the sun. And so that variance has an effect on the amount of energy hitting the earth. Because when you're talking about removing 34 watts per square meter, imagine how many watts that is per square kilometer. Then imagine how many watts that is over the entire surface of the planet. Additionally, what we have to understand is when we're coming into this particular grand solar minimum, we're going to have an eccentricity of the Earth moving away from the sun an additional million miles. And that'll be during the winter for the northern hemisphere. Additionally, the sun will be a little lower on the horizon. Now, I remember a decade ago when we were first talking to Valentina Zarkova, and I had mentioned this to her, and she looked at me like a deer in the headlights because she had never heard of the eccentricity of the sun and us being a million miles further away from the sun. And if that's a significant distance, and if you want to calculate it, it's the inverse square root of the distance. So as we're going through this GSM and in the northern hemisphere in the winter time, we're going to be a million miles further away. And that's all because of the solar giants are on one side of the sun, and we're going to be on the other side. So that's going to make a significant difference as to how cold it's going to be. Additionally, when you go into a grand solar minimum, the electromagnetic fields in the sun go out of phase. And when they do, they cancel each other out, just like a set of Bose headphones do. In canceling sound, well, electromagnetic fields are canceling each other out, which weakens the sun. When it weakens the sun, that actually weakens the electromagnetic field on the Earth as well, because our electromagnetic field is, how shall we say, influenced by the electromagnetic field of the sun. So when the electromagnetic field of the sun becomes weaker from cancellation, that allows more galactic cosmic rays to come in. Those galactic cosmic rays create additional nucleation in our atmosphere, which creates additional cloud cover. That cloud cover is basically condensation forming on nuclei, which is the result of the incoming cosmic rays. Additionally, sunspots, well, should be not sunspots, but coronal holes on the face of the sun spew out additional cosmic rays, not galactic cosmic rays. And those cosmic rays, when they enter into our atmosphere, they interact with gases and other nuclei that's already in the atmosphere, and they create showers. So a single cosmic ray coming in and impacting with anything else that's in the atmosphere will shower out kind of like a sparkler and create thousands of additional pieces of nuclei, of which moisture can condense on, and that creates more clouds, and more clouds creates more cloud cover, and more cloud cover reduces the TSI hitting the surface of the Earth. So it's kind of like a avalanching or cascading effect of this event. So basically, as more cosmic rays come in, we get more clouds. More clouds reduces the TSI, and reduction in TSI creates more snow and colder weather. So the other big part of that is, as the magnetic fields of the sun weaken and it weakens the magnetic fields of the Earth, that allows the jet stream to plunge closer towards the equator. When you have high levels of TSI and a strong sun at solar maximum, the jet stream is not as wavy, and so it doesn't have as deep a troughs. But when the sun is weak, you have a deeper trough, and that allows the polar air masses to get closer to the equator. And so when those polar air masses come down, what we used to call Alberta clippers are now called polar vortexes. And the reason they call them polar vortexes is because they're bigger and they come a lot further south than they used to. So Alberta Clipper has been retired, and now we have these polar vortexes. And we're going to see more of that. And this is, as we see more nucleation in our atmosphere, it's going to affect hurricanes and other storms by having more rain. Because the more nuclei you have in the atmosphere, the more moisture you can hold. So we're going to see more hurricanes like Harvey. We're going to see more floods like we did in North Carolina. So there's going to be a lot more of what we've been seeing here lately. And this is all, as far as I'm concerned, directly related to the grand solar minimum. In fact, when we have coronal hole streams hit our planet, and you can go back in history and see this all the way back to Katrina. If you look at Katrina and you look at Katrina when Katrina was starting to come up through the Gulf of Mexico, you can correlate that with a coronal hole stream hitting the Earth just days before Katrina went into New Orleans. And when you do that, you will actually see the intensification of the hurricane as that coronal hole stream is hitting the hurricane. And we've seen this with Harvey, we've seen it with Katrina, we saw it with the storms in North Carolina here, 90 some, or actually 6 months ago, 4 months ago, whatever it was, the storms in Western North Carolina. It's all the same deal. Anytime you already have a storm, it's going to get bigger if it gets hit by a coronal hole stream.
And least we forget Dorian.
Yeah.
Dorian was massive. Dorian was uncharted territory. And when you speak about cosmic radiation impacting the intensity of these storms, it's like giving hurricanes steroids. That's what
Exactly.
cosmic radiation does. So you're dead on with that. Next year's hurricane forecast is going to be interesting, and I know you've already spoke to me about it. You're expecting a busy year next year, and I think I can't speak for David Dilly, but we'll find out on Monday as he's working on his hurricane predictions right now for next season. But this is not a coincidence or just blind luck that this happens at the same time. When we see solar wind at high speeds, like you were talking about from a coronal hole, that will impact our magnetosphere. And cosmic radiation, that's kind of the first thing that I think that was taught to me by you was the impacts of cosmic radiation and how you could almost sometimes feel cosmic rays on your skin during certain
Well,
conditions.
that's the UV you can feel.
Yeah, that
Yep.
cool tingly sensation.
Yeah. Yep.
I've had days of just being outside at 78 degrees. This is when we lived in Buffalo, 78 degrees outside, and the wind's blowing, and there's this cool, almost Arctic feel to it. And it's in the middle of the summertime. And that was during solar minimum, this past one that we had, 16, 17, 18. So I feel like that we will definitely, what's really going to help us the most is understand just one solar cycle. You know, man has never been alive for something that we're getting ready to go through. And I think that's why a lot of people have a lot of doubt about the grand solar minimum, when it's going to happen, what its impact is going to do. This is just an opinion. You don't have to answer this to fact, but do you feel like the recent temperatures that we saw over 2024, that we got over a degree Celsius over baseline, do you think that that will help soften the blow that we get from the grand solar minimum by the time we get to 2030 and things are a lot cooler?
No, not at all. And look, when you and I first got together, I predicted back then that we were going to see temperature swings that were beyond anything that we had ever seen before. And I told you that we were going to have instances of where the grid and our infrastructure would not be able to handle the wild temperature swings and low temperatures. I told you houses in the South would lose electricity because the grid would not be able to supply enough electricity to power all of the heaters that would be necessary. Also told you there would be a collapse of the grid because ice storms and things of that nature would take down power lines. And additionally, I told you that there would be freezing of water lines in people's homes and so on and so forth because they're not designed, they were never built to handle these sub freezing temperatures. People in the South aren't used to 14 degrees Fahrenheit.
No.
Okay. And so here we just had 5 years ago, we had the Valentine's Day storm right here in Texas where I'm at. You couldn't buy PVC pipe for 6 months to fix your plumbing. There were people in Texas who didn't have running water in their house for 6 months because you couldn't get PVC pipe from the stores or anywhere. There were people here who were without power for 2 weeks. We saw temperatures down here 14 degrees, 10 degrees, stuff like people had never seen before. Additionally, like my mother-in-law who lives not far from the studio, we saw 4 inches of snow here. She's been here for 80 years and has never seen 4 inches of snow.
Yeah.
We just had snow here the other day. Last night, it was 24 degrees. With the wind chill, it was 7.
Lord.
And I'm south of Dallas.
Yeah.
So, we're already starting to see the effects of this. And the crazy part about it is, like I always say, you ain't seen nothing yet. Wait until we hit the bottom and don't come back. And then year after year after year of just imagine being in the minimum and then staying there for the next 20 years. Okay. That's going to be horrendous. And then, the problem is when we get down there, we're going to have more coronal holes. Those coronal holes are going to create additional nucleation. That nucleation is going to create more cloud cover. That cloud cover is going to again drop the temperature of the planet. So it's going to get colder and colder and colder. The skies are going to cloud over and you're going to have gray skies just like they did during the Little Ice Age. See, I did some research when I first started hearing about the grand solar minimum. This is 12 years ago or so. I did some research about everything of the grand solar minimum. And I looked at over 500 paintings and drawings and so on and so forth of the grand solar minimum. And in every single one of those, the sky was gray. And I thought, wow, the sky is gray. And, there's no birds in the
Low-lying
photograph, in,
clouds.
in the paintings. Okay. The reason being is the sky was gray.
Yep.
Somebody said, well, there's no blue paint. And I'm like, well, that's not true. Look at some of the people in the paintings, they have blue shirts or blue pants or so on and so forth.
Right.
They had blue paint. Okay. It was just that the sky was gray and there was no birds in the sky because everybody had already eaten all of them. See, a lot of people don't realize that during the last grand solar minimum, millions of people starved to death. You talk about the Great Potato Famine. Well, why was it a Great Potato Famine? Because nothing else would grow.
Yep.
The French were told by the Scottish, hey, look, you guys need to grow potatoes, not wheat. And the French are like, no, we want wheat for our croissants. Well, they grew the wheat, and the grand solar minimum destroyed the wheat harvest, and 3 or 4 million French starved to death that year because there was no wheat for their croissants.
You brought up the cold in Texas, and also back in 2018, during the heart of a minimum,
Mm-hmm.
we saw that exactly everything you were talking about, the frozen pipes, the people that were killed. The grade of insulation in the south is way different than what it is up here in the north.
Right.
So these houses were not able to keep up with that cold air, no matter if they turned it up to 90 on their thermostat. It couldn't keep up because you couldn't keep the cold out of these houses.
Right.
And that's just a small glimpse of what it's going to be like when we are actually indeed in the heart of this grand solar minimum. That's just a small window of what can happen in certain. Right now, we're just getting it sporadically, and that's what you said. The beginning of the grand solar minimum. It's not going to be this all of a sudden in your face with all this climate chaos. It will pop up, but the frequency of these events are going to continue to rise as we get
Right.
closer and closer to the 2030s.
And we can expect the winters along the Gulf of Mexico to be just as brutal as a winter in the Northeast part of the United States with feet of snow. And all of this has been proven. I mean, they even had snow in Miami. And the Seminole Indians called it white rain because they didn't have a word for snow.
No.
So there's history of this as far as, you can look at it as far as the pollen counts, and there's just over a dozen different data sets that you can look at and see they all correlate to show the grand solar minimum and how it has influenced the planet.
Well, it is definitely proof, like what we've always talked about with lower solar activity and all that cold that we were talking about, crop loss. I remember there being some crop issues in the United States from 2017 through the early 20s because of all the floods that we had across all the soil temperature would take too long to get up to where it needed to be. So the shortened crop seasons were in place during this last minimum. And this last minimum wasn't even the deepest. Well, I take that back. This minimum was considered as the deepest one since we've seen in about 120 years or so. So
Right.
this next, if things go according to a plan, this upcoming minimum should be a little bit deeper than what we saw in this previous cycle. So, and that's what Zarkova predicted. She
Mhm.
said in 25 or cycle 25, the peak will be done, and that we will start the declination into a minimum by 2025. Not start the maximum in 2025 and go on for 2 years, but actually the minimum is already the maximum's happened. We're past our peak, not by a lot, but we're starting to see it turn the corner, so to speak, when we're talking about where we are in the cycle.
Right. And when we talk about there's a decrease in the number of sunspots for the cycle, people go, "Oh, well, the peak is higher." Well, we're not talking about the peak.
Yep.
We're talking about the total number of sunspots over that cycle. And people can see it right now. I mean, you can look up over here. People can look and see we're already coming down. And it ain't coming back, folks. It ain't coming back. We've already passed the peak. NASA has already admitted we're past the peak. We're a year early, year and a half early going by the peak. So yeah, we're done. It's all downhill from here. The temperatures, it's all going to be, continue to get colder and cooler. We're going to see more wild swings in the jet stream, more extreme temperatures in the south, and we're going to see rapid temperature changes like we've never seen. And that's because these jet streams plunging south are going to bring this Arctic air down, and we're going to see temperature swings of over 50 degrees in a day.
Which we've seen that.
Right.
Spots, periodically. We've seen it
Right.
already.
And I predicted that over a decade ago, and we're starting to see that now. But it's going to be more prevalent as we continue to go forward, because as the jet stream, and we're going to see, snow in Mexico, okay, which we've already seen a couple times already. I predicted that back in 2014, 2015. Yep. People thought I was out of my mind. And I said, well, maybe so, but you're still going to see snow in Mexico.
Right now, another thing that's happening that happened 11 years ago, 2014, the 2013 into 2014 winter, I was still living back in Dayton, Ohio. And I want to speak on this because the same exact scenario is happening again in Ohio with the polar vortex and with the snow accumulation. I mean, we maybe average 2 inches of snow in a month in Dayton, Ohio for January, February, March, if that, all right? We get maybe one storm of 6 to 8 inches every 3 or 4 years or so. It's not snowy like it used to be when I was a kid. But it is interesting. In 2014, we were at the same position that we are right now. We're heading out of a max, beginning declining solar activity. And you would think, well, it's a maximum, Jake. Why is it cold? Why is it, what's going on that causes that? And the only thing that I could suggest is that during the solar maximum, okay, and when you're starting to come out of the solar maximum, that means the magnetosphere begins to weaken once again. More cosmic rays are able to interact in our atmosphere, which creates that wavy jet stream, and now we get a weak polar jet, which will bring more polar air into the United States and further south. But I think it's really interesting that we're going to be seeing similar temperatures here in this week and next week. Temperatures could be -50 for wind chills. Unfortunately, my mother passed away in January of 14. I remember that funeral because it was a high of -6 that day, and the wind chills were about -35. That was the fastest service I've ever attended in my life. It was really quick. They gave everybody blankets. It was really, really cold. And it wasn't coincidence. Again, these cycles all line up, and it's just 11 years ago was also another solar cycle ago. So I guess the reason why I'm repeating this information is that there's been a lot of negative press about grand solar minimum because we saw this active summer, but we were supposed to see that active summer. And now that solar output is starting to be reduced, we're also seeing how Earth is reacting to that weaker output now, that weaker magnetic connection that we're going to be having with our sun. And that will also lower our strength of our magnetosphere. One thing I did want to ask you, and I don't know if you know a lot about it. If you don't, that's fine. But the South Atlantic anomaly, where the magnetic field, I remember when this all kind of started out, there was a guy on YouTube. He did a video about it a few years ago. It was very small. It was just a little tiny blob outside of, west of Africa off the coast. Now this area is stretched out from Western Africa to parts of South America. It's getting bigger. Does this
have weakening?
Yeah. So does this in direction
yes,
correlation
absolutely.
with the sun?
That's weakening of the sun. Just like everybody makes this big deal about the magnetic pole reversal. Well, hello, the magnetic field of the sun is weaker, and as the magnetic field of the sun is weaker, it's going to allow the magnetic field of the Earth to do more what it wants to do. And all these people are freaking out over the North Pole moving. Well, hello, how about you go track the North Pole? You'll find out that it's moving more towards the geographic North Pole. Okay, it's not moving away from the North Pole, it's moving towards the North Pole. And the reason for that is because we have less influence from our sun. Additionally, this idea that the magnetic fields can flip overnight, I don't go for that. That's because the molten core of our planet is more like a lava lamp. And so as we go into the grand solar minimum, the magnetic fields of the Earth are going to change. And it's also going to affect the migration patterns of birds and other species that use magnetic fields for navigation. So, birds see the Earth like a topo map, but to them, it's a magnetic field map. So just imagine the magnetic fields of the Earth, and that's how they see it. So when the sun weakens and those magnetic fields change, it changes the migratory patterns of birds and fish and all kinds of things that use magnetic fields.
And that makes complete sense. I remember back in the minimum, this previous minimum, you'd always see videos of birds behaving erratically, flying in all different directions, some even falling to the ground. And I'm sure that had to do with the weak magnetosphere as well.
Right. Well, some of that is also going to be these bursts of cold air that we're going to have coming down from the stratosphere. So, and we've already seen that. In fact, years ago, I had a video of where the temperature dropped 30 degrees in a matter of minutes as one of these, polar, I can't remember what they call it, but it's when you have ice cold air. You remember the movie The Day After?
Oh, yeah.
Where they talk about, well,
my favorite movie.
That was over the whole planet, but they have smaller versions of that where this stratospheric cooling comes down. And there's actually a video of a guy sitting in his car, and you can actually see the ice forming on his windshield. It happens so fast. And we're going to see more of that. And as the fronts come down from the North Pole, that air is going to move right with it. It displaces that cold air. Warm air comes up from the south as the jet stream drops, and that polar air moves to the south. So you can have a nice day, and the next thing you know, it's 20, 30, 40 degrees colder than it was just an hour or two ago. And so that has caught a lot of people off guard, and people have died of exposure and so on and so forth because they weren't expecting that to transpire.
Correct me if I'm wrong in this. I was just kind of grazing the comment section, and somebody had said something about the sun's magnetic flip. But isn't it true that the sun does more than one magnetic pole flip during its cycle as well? Like, it's not an uncommon thing for the.
Well, it flips. We call a solar cycle 11 years, but it's actually
22.
not. It's actually right. It's actually, and there's not two magnetic fields in the sun. There's actually four.
Yep.
And so it's those magnetic fields going out of phase, which is what the problem is now. And so you have a 206-year cycle, like Dr. John Casey says, or a 410-year cycle, which is worse. So you have every 206 years, you have a cycle. The problem is that every other one of those cycles is worse.
Yep.
So we're getting ready to go into the worst cycle we've seen in almost 100,000 years.
Well,
so this is going to be the worst cancellation at the lowest level, and this is all proven by the magnetic fields, and you can see that from Dr. Valentina Zarkova's work with the Wilcox Solar Observatory and studying the magnetic fields.
Well, also, you were talking about this is going to be one of the worst cycles in 100,000 years, and that's part in because of where we are right now in the Milankovitch cycle. And I've got up on the screen a graphic of where the four gas giants are. Obviously, we have moved since that position, but Now we are dealing with other planets also behind Earth, pulling on the Earth, tugging as well. Again, we talked about this off air, but we've seen temperature drops globally since October, and that's when this giant tug began, when we were lined up right there in the middle. I'll show everybody with my handy dandy
And what people
camera.
don't realize, or a lot of people don't realize, is the sun doesn't set in the middle of our solar system.
No,
The sun is tugged on by the gas giants. And so when we're on the opposite side of the sun from the gas giants, that's when we're a million miles away further than we normally are. And that's going to be a significant change in the solar TSI that we get. Plus, we're going to be not on our standard plane. We'll be a little higher, so the sun will be lower on the horizon than normal by up to 5 degrees. And so that's going to be bad.
We went from being on a side of the solar system where the connection with the sun and the planets were stronger. Now we're going to go on the weak side of the sun, and plus a million miles farther out. So
Right.
on the weak side of the sun, we're going to be experiencing a weaker magnetosphere, obviously, which will increase cosmic radiation once again. And we're not even in the minimum part of this cycle. So it's kind of a good thing that we're seeing this lineup now versus doing this during a minimum cycle. Temperatures could be even cooler than what they're predicting in the B if that was the case. But
Right. And when you're on the weaker side, you have a greater chance of a significant CME.
right, that was my next question to you. And I don't think, to me, I don't think this cycle has had strong enough solar flares to produce anything mind blowing. If we could remember the solar storm we had back in Halloween of 2003, that was much stronger. There was grid failures across the world, but nothing like widespread. Tell us what kind of a solar flare, what kind of conditions do we need to have to get some kind of a solar flare that could impact Earth in the same way it did during the Carrington event in
Well,
1856.
if you're on the opposite side of the sun from the gas giants, that's a factor. And then the farther we go into the grand solar minimum, and these magnetic fields are further out of phase, the harder they're going to be fighting each other. And so you have to look at it as they're working together when you're at a solar maximum. They're all pulling the same way, they're all pushing the same way, they're working together in unison. It's when the magnetic fields are out of phase with each other that you have these wild magnetic events. It's kind of like taking two magnets that are super magnets and trying to push them together. So both of the North Poles pushing together. And if you were to do that underneath a piece of paper with iron filings on it, as you're trying to push those two magnets together, you're going to see the magnetic flux lines in those iron filings jump all over the page as those two magnetic fields are fighting each other. And that is when you can expect these massive CMEs. So the further we go into it, and historically speaking, if you talk about CMEs and volcanic eruptions and seismic events taking place, historically, it's 70-30. 70% of them happen while you're going into the grand solar minimum, 30% of them happen when you're coming out of the grand solar minimum. So it's within the next 15 years or so that we're going to see the worst part for earthquakes, volcanoes, things of that nature,
Yeah.
even flooding.
Well, that's
And
yeah.
my wife, when we first met and we were looking for property together, I said, you know, these creeks that you see flowing down through these areas, if you'll look and you'll see that creek, if you look on both sides, there's a plane that comes out from that that's cleared and then it goes up. So it's kind of like a small creek inside of a river. I said, never ever buy a house in that flat plain next to that creek. And she said, why? I said, because it's going to flood. She's like, well, the floodplains doesn't show that. The maps, it's a 100-year flood. I
Right.
said, we're not on a 100-year cycle.
Right.
We're on a 206-year cycle. And then in that 206-year cycle, there's a 410-year cycle, and it's the 410-year that gets you.
Yep.
And I said, nobody was around then. They don't know. You're going to see this. And so my wife looked at me like I was nuts for 10 years because I was telling her, don't ever buy in these areas. And so then they had the floods in North Carolina, and we owned land in North Carolina.
That's awful out there.
And she saw exactly what I was talking about. And when I came back from North Carolina, she said, I never really understood what you were talking about, not building homes along the rivers, like you said. She says, but now I see exactly what you were saying and why you should never have a house there, because it's a river, or it's a creek now, but when you have these grand solar minimum flooding, like we will, okay, California ain't seen nothing yet.
No.
When you look back to I think it was 1812, when the governor of California took office in I think it was 1812 or whatever year it was when they had the massive floods. He was delivered to the governor's mansion in a rowboat, and he went into the governor's mansion through the attic window.
Wow.
So not the first story window, not the second story window. He went in through the attic window above the second story. That's how much flooding there was back then. And we're going to see that again. And this time the problem is it's going to be worse. So we've got all these fires out there, and that's a combination of mismanagement, no water, the budget was cut, failure to remove the dead, dying, and diseased underbrush, no water in the reservoirs. And now, because we've had these massive fires out there, and arsonists, by the way,
Yeah.
arsonists involved in what's going on in
Yep.
California right now. Now we're going to have all these rain events come, and we're going to have mudslides like you've never seen, because they've had no moisture. It's all burned away, and now there's nothing holding that back. So if you think California looks bad now, wait until the rain comes.
And that's a point that I was going to bring up as well, because I know that there has been desperation with water, not a widespread action, but there has been agencies that has used salt water to put this
Right.
fire out. And what does salt water do to vegetation? So
Kills it.
when you talk about mudslides, if they have to use more salt water to put these fires out, it's going to be epic proportions when it comes to these rains and the mudslides. Nothing's going to grow in these areas.
Right.
So, and again, this is just the tip. This is not the full-fledged grand solar minimum. We are working our way down into that, and a lot of people don't understand that this is just not something that happens overnight. This is a decadal process, and
Right.
like I said, we've covered now almost an entire half of a solar cycle of 11 years. We've been paying attention to this. And it's just interesting to see how things are returning to the conditions that we saw when we first started this channel. I wish that we get more help from our federal government when it comes to getting this kind of information out to the people, because a lot of us are going to be standing there like deer in headlights when this happens and we can't get certain foods at the grocery store. I'm already noticing that there is it's like a wave. Things come and go. There's some things that are available one week at a grocery store. I'll go back the next week. That's not available, but the substitution that I would get for is. And then there's some weeks where neither items are available. And these are potato products. These are bread products. So this isn't nothing elegant or fancy. So, and like I said, I do remember all the crop failure that we had. Our good friend Matt Bros, who was a farmer in Nebraska for a long time, and what made him a subscriber and a believer about everything that you and myself and others in the community were talking about. He was a farmer. He saw firsthand things that he's never seen. I think a third generation farmer. Father telling stories. I've never seen this before. I've never seen this before. This is very new, and they got out. They got out of the farming business. Matt now works for a bank, and he helps farmers with loans to help rebuild their farms. And he's a great analyst for them, so he's a huge asset for that company he works for. But because of the grand solar minimum, we're already seeing some economic changes. Farmers saying, "I'm done. I can't do this anymore." As expensive as everything is with oil and gas and diesel and cost of supply and getting it here to our country, it's too expensive, and farms are disappearing fast. And that's concerning. We better figure out really fast on how we can get these indoor growing facilities online. And
and they're being destroyed. So, and I'm going to give you a prime example. We have a greenhouse here. The wind was so high last night, it destroyed it. It's on the ground. Our greenhouse is leveled just from the wind overnight. So, we spent weeks building it, and overnight it's leveled. And this is the problem. We're not prepared. Not just my wife and I. I mean, we're a lot more prepared than most people.
Right.
But society is not prepared for what we're about to see. People need to have grow lights. Go to Walmart or wherever and get the red and blue grow lights, because it only takes 5 to 7 frequencies of light to grow plants. Get those grow lights to augment your greenhouse or your indoor growing. You're going to have to, because if you don't, your plants aren't going to mature and you're not going to have anything to eat. Stock up on flour, stock up on beans, stock up on canned goods. I just saw a video the other day. People were worried about, how good is something that's been in a can for a long period of time. I saw them open a can of water from World War One. Okay, the water was fine. They tested it. So canned goods last a whole lot longer than people think.
And they do have shelf life. They have dates on
Right.
it too. So it's not like you don't have to blindly go into it. But I know people that have gardens that will can their own produce, and that lasts a little bit longer, obviously, with that
You
process.
can store eggs for years.
Yeah.
You can put them in water with, I think it's lime and something else, and store. We have 50 chickens, so we have a lot of eggs here. But we give eggs away. We have so many.
Well, there's your supplemental income right there. As expensive eggs are these days.
Yeah. So we have been canning our eggs and giving our eggs away to family, friends, neighbors, so on and so forth, because we have so many of them. We gather 2 to 3 dozen eggs a day. So it's kind of difficult to eat that many.
No, you can't.
Right. So
I wouldn't want to live in the same house with someone who all they eat is eggs.
Right. So, but anyway, so we have a lot of eggs, and then we have our bunnies and pigs and so on and so forth as a food supply. And then we have our own water supply and everything else. But everybody needs to have a water supply. Everybody needs to have a food supply. They need to stockpile, because when it hits, you won't be able to go to the store and buy groceries. They're not going to be there. Okay. When the food runs out, the food runs out. And if you don't have it stockpiled, well, you're in trouble. I mean, we have tons of food, literally.
Right.
So, that's how we have stocked up. We've been stocking up for years. So, we buy flour in 55 gallon or in 50-pound bags and have metal trash cans full. Then don't use plastic containers, because the rats will chew right through that, mice, anything else. So we keep everything in metal containers. And that goes for the beans, the rice, the salt, the pepper, all that stuff. We purchase in bulk. So I think we have like 500, 600 pounds just of flour.
A lot of folks will always also mention too that they don't have the means to prep like they'd like to. And I guess to that, I just hope that over the next couple of years, since you know who is going to be clocking in tomorrow morning, that
Right.
we'll see an ease on the cost of goods, and once again people can start stocking up and having a surplus again. Right now, I know a lot of folks are just, you know, doing their best to pay their bills and keep food on the table as it stands right now. Think the
Well,
high.
that's the advantage of buying in bulk,
Yeah,
because you can get a bag of flour cheap if you buy, a 40-pound, 50-pound bag. And go to these grocers that supply restaurant supplies, as opposed to trying to buy it at Walmart.
right.
And then the other thing is, anytime you buy these products, don't put them into the can right away. Stick them into a freezer for at least 48 hours. That way, if there's any weevils or anything like that in your bag of flour, when you stick them into the freezer, it'll kill them. And that way, when you come and open up your supply years from now, you find out you actually have flour as opposed to having a weevil population.
What do you do with the dead weevils in the flour though?
No, you pick the small ones, because you always have to pick the lesser of two weevils.
Gotcha. Okay, a little flower humor there. Never thought I'd
Yeah,
have the day where we'd have flower humor on the Grand Solar Minimum Jam, but here we are. We got Lee Wheelbarger, so that's good stuff.
yeah.
All right, well, Lee, I think we could wrap this up, but I can tell you, I really would like to hopefully extend this, this round table uh,
Sure.
and into the future, because I think things are now hitting that point where it's important to pay attention. It's always important to pay attention. Just because we haven't been on the air doesn't mean the Grand Solar Minimum went away. But
Right.
I feel like the main motivation for Mari and myself to come back to do this again is that we've observed for the last 10 years, we're starting to see things that we've already seen before and they're getting worse. So it is important information. And again, we need to share this everywhere we can, not just with me and Lee, but anyone else who's willing to talk about solar forcing that drives the climate. Because here in a few hours, a lot of these Green New Deal policies are going to get ripped up. And we're going to start seeing the differences in taxes and what we're spending money on from all. Think about it this way, guys. We've had the temperatures this year, in some cases, have been told us that we've reached that 1.5 degree above baseline temperature. All right. If that's the case, what a shame that is, because we have been practicing this Green New Deal policy since the day Biden got into office, and it hasn't went down any at all. It's actually went up. It's went worse because CO2 does not cause global warming. And it's finally starting to show. Like, we've only had a difference, an increase of parts per million. I think it was 3 parts per million over the last 4 years. I'm here to tell you that does not cause record-breaking temperatures, zero point 0.3 parts per million. If that's the case, then we're at 422 parts per million. We should be 1,000 degrees as a normal temperature.
Right. And,
So,
and there's a couple things with these temperatures. Okay. First off, the National Weather Service has deleted all kinds of rural temperature stations. So when you only take temperatures from heat islands in major cities, well, guess what? The temperature goes up.
yep.
Because now you're not taking the temperature from out in the middle of nowhere. Additionally, a lot of these new temperature reading stations have been moved to airports.
Yeah.
And so now you've got jet exhaust blowing towards the towards the temperature stations, and that's pushing the temperature up. I mean, I remember when this was first being reported, I'm like, are you kidding me? And so I actually got a map from the National Weather Service that shows where all of these temperature stations were, and they put them at the ends of runways where jets who are lined up to take off, their exhaust is blowing in that direction. Yes, it may be a couple hundred yards away, but I'm sorry, when you're sitting over there with a jet engine for 12 hours a day, blowing hot air in that direction, it does have a tendency to warm things up.
On top of the fact that the tarmac also absorbs
Exactly.
sunlight all day
Exactly.
long.
That was going to be my next point. And it's like the one city that was counting pollution. Okay. Well, what did they do? They put all of their sensors on the bus route, and the sensors are just past the bus stop at the same height as the exhaust coming out of the bus. So every bus that pulls off from the bus stop, the black smoke rolls out and blows right onto the sensor. And I'm like, how do you set that up? You know, how come you couldn't have put it before the bus stop? You had to put it 20 feet past the bus stop so that when the bus pulls off, black smoke is rolling out and blows right onto the sensor, which is 12 feet off the ground. How do you guys, I mean, did you plan that? Because it sure as hell looks that way. And you put all of them on the bus route. You didn't put any of them anywhere else. They're just on the bus route. So, you know, and there's a lot of people who have researched this. It's not just me. You can go out and see that there's lots of videos on YouTube about people who have went out and studied where the temperature sensors are and the pollution sensors. So there's just, you know, it's misinformation intentionally. Okay. And there's a lot of people that have been doing it. A lot of people have bought into it. And they have spent billions on this Green New Deal that does nothing. It is impossible for everyone to own an electric car.
Absolutely.
The grid won't support it. And what people don't realize is, let's say that, you know, the amount of electricity that you and your family use, that's great. If you get one electric car, you've now doubled your electric consumption. If you get two electric cars, you've now tripled your electric consumption. Our grid won't handle that. Will not handle that. We don't have the production for that. And then the other issue is, like, I was watching the hearings the other day because I have 8 news channels. So I was watching the hearings the other day, and the new guy in charge of the EPA was coming in and going, "We can't support this." You know, and the guy says, "Well, you have to." One of the senators said, "Well, you have to," or congressman said, "Well, you know, we have to use these green energy policies." And we're like, we can't. You still have to have the baseline production because everything else is intermittent. Wind is intermittent. Solar is intermittent. So you still have to be able to supply the core demand with nuclear or coal or natural gas or whatever it is. You can't do that with solar until the storage is present. And you talk about solar and storage, you saw the fire in California. Oh, yeah. Okay, that's toxic. They had to evacuate.
Yep.
Okay, we need to have more solar and we need to have more hydro.
Yes, agreed.
And the hydro needs to be a copy of the Bath County project, which is where during the day, when they have more demand, they pull water out of the reservoir and it goes through the turbines and goes into another reservoir. And at night, when they don't have the demand, they pump the water back uphill. And then they use it again the following day. So day after day, they can use the same water over and over and over again. It's like battery storage, but with water. And then you don't have these giant fires. And there is no better storage than water because it lasts forever. And hydro is the cheapest form of power production. And you don't have the waste. Now, the cost of solar panels have now come down to the life of a solar panel being 25, 30 years. That cost has now come down to about the same as hydro. However, that's over that 30 years, and then at the end of the 30 years, you have to replace it, whereas with the hydro, you don't. So, and you don't have the waste, you don't have the transportation, you don't have the cost, so on and so forth. So hydro is the way to go for storage of energy, in my professional opinion.
Yeah, and one more thing on the electric vehicles. I saw a video this morning where a guy was driving into an Amazon truck yard, and all the Amazon trucks were hooked up to their charging stations. And then over in the corner of the lot, there was a tractor trailer size diesel operated generator that runs these charging stations. It's like, are you kidding me? We are wasting money on this big time,
Right.
and it's being put right in our faces. That's the sad part. So, well, Lee, I think we're going to wrap this up, but I want to say hello to a few people, then I'll give the mic to you at the end here. But good seeing a lot of old faces and new faces. Thank you to all of Lee Wheelbarger KLW News troopers being over here today as well. But good seeing Knife Collector, Reverend Fry. I know I've seen a lot of people, Wood Spirit in here as well. Mari, man in the chat as always. Helene, welcome over here. I know I see you almost all the time. I'm on the Rumble channel. So good to see some familiar faces from the KLW News team. But I'd like to let Lee take the last few seconds here before we end this broadcast. Lee, go ahead.
Well, first off, I want to thank you for having me. It's been a long time coming, and you're absolutely right. We should continue to do this and inform people about what's going on. On the KLW World News Network, for our private members, we actually have roundtables, and we talk about the grand solar minimum. And we have been preparing for this and other events. In fact, we now have a global communication system which is secure that you can use over your cell phone. And then we also have our own two-way radio system that's global. So we've been putting that together. So as I talked about getting you a radio, so that you can pick up a microphone and talk directly to me here in Texas from up in New York. And we do that regularly. I talk to New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, all direct, no satellite, no repeater system, radio to radio. And we've been working for years to build this system. So that's one of the advantages of being on the KLW World News Network. But, we need to continue to inform people. We need to continue to put this in people's faces. So, like you said, we need to do more shows, and we need to get this more widespread. And what I'm going to do is, when this show is over, I'm going to download it and I'm going to upload it on my news channels so that people can see it over there. And we're going to point people towards you. And I'm going to let you take the lead on Grand Solar Minimum News, because I've already got 8 channels. Gotcha. And I don't need to take on another one, especially when you're doing such a great job of it.
Thank you.
So I want to thank you and Mari for the job that you guys have been doing. I'm so glad that I educated you guys, or at least showed this to you.
Yep.
So that you could pick up the torch and continue to carry it and wave it in front of everybody's face and say, look, folks, this is what's going on. So I just want to thank you for everything you guys are doing, and greatly appreciate you having me, and keep up the great work.
Well, it's always a pleasure, especially when talking to you. Lee, I could go on for hours, but I know you're a busy man with your schedule as well as I am. But again, it's always a pleasure talking to you about this topic, and I'm glad that we were able to have you on today. Guys, that's going to wrap it up for us today. Thank you for tuning in to the Grand Solar Minimum with our special guest, Lee Wheelbarger, inventor, I might add as well. Check him out on KLW World News on Rumble, and also from time to time YouTube, but Rumble is the main platform for these guys.
Yeah, we're giving up YouTube.
I hear you. I hear you. All right, guys, take care. Have a great weekend, and we will talk soon.
Do you like this show? Give us a thumbs up. Want to support us more? Share to your favorite social media platform. Buy a t-shirt or become a Patreon. All links are in the description.